Hey guys, Christina Cerny here. I did my case study on a friend who lives here in Nashville named Heinrich Zayman. He's a South African digital artist who does mostly freelance work in the city. I chose to do the case study on him because I've enjoyed so many of our conversations about the cross-sections between politics, art, culture, and I wanted to learn more about how they interacted in his life growing up with two major cultures. Here's a little snapshot of his story and also some of his art. But before that, I wanted to explain, so I named this a South African American Creativity Hub because that's really what Hein embodies. Creative hubs are organizations that use their space or infrastructure for networking, organizational, and business development within the cultural and creative industries sector. So I've been vacillating between a bunch of different titles, but I settled on this title because Hein himself really acts as a creative hub. In terms of a timeline where culture and creativity began to meet in Hein's life, he moved to Colorado when he was 6, where he lived on a farm, and that's where he got really close to his brother. They spoke Afrikaans at home, which is a West Germanic language spoken in South Africa. Hein began drawing in school in 5th grade, and then he took drawing classes at the end of middle school through high school. This was when his interest in tribalism developed, fusing his South African heritage with his art. Hein applied and was accepted into the business school at Colorado University, but transferred to art school shortly after that. And then he went to New York City to attend Pratt Institute, where he got a part scholarship and won best in class from an art show, which gave him another semester paid for free. Because of his drawing skills, he also worked for an ad agency there. While at Pratt, he settled on digital art with a 3D animation focus. During his time in New York City, he got into freelance work, and his parents helped out with rent. When I interviewed him for this case study, he reflected on how artists sometimes measure their success on their ability to pay rent. And then he laughed about that. He moved to Nashville after a bad breakup to be with his brother, and they started pursuing their own ideas in art. Hein did the branding for his brother Vion's music project. He made avatar characters and put them in a world surrounded by the themes of his music, but Hein noted that even working with his brother, he was under direction there as well. So at this point, he decided to move into the room next door to have his own studio, despite everyone around him telling him that all he needed was a computer. He wanted to hang his art up and have space to paint and potentially start screen printing. He really just wanted his own space. Now he freelances in town, which looks different depending on the project. Right now he's storyboarding, he has a contract gig, and he's working on a personal children's book called The Life of Ollie, which I'll tell you about at the end. And he launched that book on Kickstarter. Since then, he's been contracted by a distributor and a publisher for that work, so we'll see what happens with it. The art included on this slide are his personal pieces. He made the art on the top right for his current girlfriend of a year, and the other one for his parents' 30th anniversary. So I interviewed Hein and I asked him a series of questions, and so that's kind of how I set up this presentation. The first question I asked was to describe his home culture. He explained that his home culture was a place of debate and rational argument, but that his family was extremely tight-knit. Part of the reason for this may have been that he spoke Afrikaans at home with his parents and siblings, which he said was like having a secret language. He described his family as very conservative, while his surroundings outside his home were fairly liberal. Although being close with his family was a staple growing up, it's been hard for him in his adult life to separate from that nuclear family. Toward high school and middle school, the separation he felt from others was more political, but in elementary school it was more cultural because he and his brother didn't know the same cultural elements as other kids. His mom taught him and his brother English at home, and he told a story about how he remembers his struggle with the word the. Because he spoke primarily Afrikaans, he had trouble putting together the TH sound, and he said he was throwing out Fs, he just couldn't figure it out. He was a creative child from the beginning. He said on the first day of American school, his mom came to pick him up early, and he was in front of the class singing a South African song in a tribal black language, and he just remembers that really vividly. Another interesting element about Hein is that he realized he was colorblind in elementary school. He laughed when he said that because apparently people say now that he does such interesting color combinations, and his career is a digital artist, so it's interesting that he's colorblind. Heinz started drawing in 5th grade. In an attempt to be cool with the skater kids, he started making logos for them. And then his mom got concerned when she saw the skulls with cornrows he was making, so because of that, Heinz started to make his own creations, cows with cornrows. But these were cartoon cows that he imagined in his head. He explained that when a person first starts drawing, they think in shapes more than in 3D, and these cows were just made up of these shapes that he was learning how to draw. He said, "As far as stories and worlds, I can't place that very well. It came out of play with my brother. We would imagine stuff. I don't know what made us both pursue a creative field. He's a musician and producer. I really think it's because the games we played weren't really social games, but instead we had our toys and we started building worlds with them." Back in South Africa, when I was 4 or 5, my dad got us little toys called JoJo's, single pieces of plastic with these big eyes. That day we found a nook in a wall and we chose a king and his 2 bishops and we would play out scenarios. I first started noticing that it wasn't normal in middle school. These fantasy worlds were logical and became more so as I grew up. Now I'm starting to pull away from that a little bit. I would sit in the car and think of these things and problem solve. How does this cool visual idea work logically, I'd ask. I realized this wasn't normal because I would talk to other kids about building imaginary worlds. Later in life, I remembered the conversation about a kid who built an imaginary Jello world, and I realized that wasn't the same thing. He wasn't creating characters and building these complex logical worlds. Hein thought about this question for a long time, about when he started learning about his heritage and how that affects his creativity, and said that he was almost always aware of his heritage, but he became more aware of it when he moved to the States. Heinz started out songwriting, actually, before drawing, at a young age. One of his early songs was about South African War. He didn't know much about it, but loved the names in the war, like General Prinsloo, the old South African names, he said. When Hein was in high school, he started writing music, which was usually historical and story-driven, almost like writing poetry. He remembers how South Africa had this Civil War era technology culture, and he loved the aesthetic of that. The South African people trekked to get away from the British into unknown territory, which he was fascinated by. The music he writes in his free time has a ton of South African references to the anthem and to the Free State, which is a province in South Africa. He said whenever he gets time or he's not working, he sits down and has drinks with figures from South African history in his head. He also said the best part about being bilingual is that you see language as a lot more malleable. You don't associate words with what they mean as much. You can play with the sounds of words more. So he wrote a song and threw some syllables from the end of the South African anthem into the song, and even though he didn't know what it meant, it sounded cool. And when he looked up the meaning, it actually made perfect sense, which is pretty ironic. On this slide, you'll see some pictures. The one that says Ghost of You, and then the one on the left with the tree, those were both artwork for his brother as a musician, and then the one under that, the map, is actually a map from his children's book that he's creating. For this question, I'm going to summarize some things Heinz said as if he were talking to y'all. So he said, both are Western cultures, so they complement each other. Growing up in South Africa until I was 6 was kind of like growing up in 50s America. South Africans are extremely conservative. Any real white South African family when I was growing up had help, a housemaid and yard worker. Lizzie, our housemaid, really raised me and my brother alongside with my mother, and sometimes Lizzie's kid too, who taught us the Macarena. South Africa really valued the nuclear family, so coming here was radical. It depends on where in America. Some places value the same things as South African culture, and in South Africa, since it's smaller, it becomes homogenous in its thinking. When I learned about South African history in school, the teachers always talked about how horrible they were, but there's a lot that history class doesn't touch on, and it's a very complex issue. South Africans during the apartheid era never performed in any lynchings of blacks. There were riots, but no acts of violence. It was never about hating the black man, but how do you live in a majority black nation when you are a white person in power? I think that was the question being asked. The racist aspects have a much different feel than they do here, but also I grew up post-apartheid. I know that healthcare before apartheid fell was some of the best you could get. We flew back there for any kind of operation because the doctors were so good. The engineering was better than things in America, especially with the military. Something I've seen recently in South African culture is that everyone there wants the white South African culture to be strong and relevant and something worth noting, because the truth is it's falling apart now. The world hates it. Everyone's moving. Hine embodies multiple creativity indicators on Torrance scales. Here are a couple that I noticed in our short interview. Expresses feelings and emotions in visual art media, becomes very involved in storytelling, engages in fantasy and storytelling, experiences real joy in drawing, understands subject matter by drawing it, communicates skillfully through drawings, creates songs or music, self-initiated learning, eagerness to tell others about discoveries, willingness to consider or toy with a strange idea. He is imaginative and enjoys pretending and daydreaming. This is what Hine so eloquently and nostalgically said when I asked him about the cross-section between his creativity and his heritage. There's South African motifs that come up, African animals that roam the Arctic, snow zebras, but I don't know why I go back to it so much, but there's something in me that goes back to Ladysmith Black Mambazo. It's a black a cappella group who sings in Ubuntu. I love the earthy Africanness of it. One night we were listening to it as a family and drinking, and I sang along to it and I knew every syllable of every word. When I first started drawing, I gave every character dreads and African styling. The first real world that I came up with was a sea of sand dunes, but it moves like water does. Everything was African and Middle Eastern themed, tribal African culture that tamed animals and rode lions and stuff. My brother has always loved northern-esque things like British styling, the cold, mountains, pine trees. I know there's something in me, the zone, the flow state in a project, when I started realizing I really hit that when I get into the tribalism and tribal African things and aesthetics. Something about it I just love. A love for a perceived African culture. Maybe if I were steeped in it fully, I wouldn't have the creative flexibility I feel now. And these two pictures are from the children's book that he's creating. So that's him in the bottom right-hand corner with his girlfriend. And that's pretty much all I have for you guys. But if you liked hearing about Hine and his artistry, seriously check out his Kickstarter. It's pretty amazing, and it would make a great gift for a kid in your life. A kid who loves fantasy and creating and imagination. Also, if you're ever looking for a freelancer, he's pretty booked up these days, but he's always an option for you. So thanks so much for listening.